Hello, thank you for joining us. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Please feel free to tell us where you're joining from in the chat feature. We'll get started in just a few minutes. Hello, and thank you for joining today's webinar. We are ready to begin. Today's webinar is eligible for 1 contact hour. Sigma Theta Tau International Honor Society of Nursing, also known as Sigma, is accredited as a provider of nursing continuing professional development by the American Nurses Credentialing Center's Commission on Accreditation. No one in control of the content today have any relevant financial relationships with ineligible companies. To receive contact hours for this NCPD session, participants are required to attend the webinar and log into our learning management system to complete an evaluation form. Information on how to access this will be emailed to all attendees approximately 1 week after the webinar. This webinar is being recorded and will be available via the Sigma repository and the learning management system as soon as we can get them uploaded. Following the presentation, if we have time, we'll have a question and answer session. You'll see on your Zoom webinar control panel that you can send a message through the Q&A feature. This is where you can type in any question you'd like to pose to our presenter. Be sure to hit send so the message makes it to us. Please use the Q&A feature for questions and the chat feature to interact with other participants. We'd like to thank our speaker for sharing their expertise with us today. Of note, thoughts and views expressed are that of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect that of Sigma. This webinar is proudly sponsored by Pro Liability and is the second webinar in the Creating Safety Nets for Your Nursing Practice webinar series. And our presenter today is Madison Edwards. Madison is a nursing professional with extensive experience in nursing leadership and regulation. Based in Oklahoma City, Madison has served as the director in both inpatient and ambulatory settings, and as the Director of Nursing in a Joint Commission certified facility. With a background in surgery and perioperative care, Madison has led large interdisciplinary teams in a variety of healthcare settings, ensuring the highest of standards for patient care. Additionally, Madison has contributed to the nursing profession as the Associate Director for Nursing Practice for a State Board of Nursing, demonstrating a commitment to quality and regulatory compliance. Madison has a passion for creating high reliability processes to ensure the safest patient care. We are so thankful to have you, Madison, and we're going to turn it over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Hello. I'm so excited for you to join me today for this presentation. Today, we're going to talk about empowered nursing, balancing staffing challenges, smart delegation, and professional integrity. So this is the second in our series of 3 presentations that I'm providing on a curated selection of topics that I hope that you find helpful to your nursing practice. Many of these topics come not only straight from my heart, but from years on the front line. Like Linda said, in hospital administration, as a nursing board regulator and ultimately a risk manager. Again, my name's Madison, and I'm the Executive Vice President of Omnisure Consulting Risk Management Services. I was lucky enough to stumble across this picture of me in my Sigma cord at graduation, and I love to laugh because this is a picture of a picture. This is pre-cloud. There was no cloud or cell phone photos, so that's a picture I have downstairs. So I graduated nursing school, and I could not wait to get directly into the trenches. I worked briefly as a labor and delivery nurse, and then quickly found my niche in transplant in the OR, doing liver and kidney transplant, both living and deceased donors. These were the best years of my nursing life. And then quickly I moved on to be the director of the OR for ambulatory surgery, and then ultimately became the director of nursing at our women's hospital. And then my life took a complete 180. I went to go work for the Board of Nursing in my state. And my eyes were opened. And I realized that everything that I thought that I knew about nursing regulation was not true, was something that I'd heard from someone I worked with, was a horror story from somebody else. And so very quickly, I realized that I wanted to work at the board, learn everything that I could, and then go put all of this into action and then send it to other nurses so that you guys can benefit from what I learned there. So today's topics get directly into the nitty gritty of your practice. And therefore, a little further into the way that decisions are made and interpreted in each state. So I have to caveat right here and say, I'm located in the United States. My experience is with a singular state. However, there's a big umbrella called the NCSBN, which is the National Council for State Boards of Nursing, which kind of inspires how states write their legislation. All of this to say, I'm going to be sending big reminders the whole time that these are jurisdiction sensitive topics. So just be mindful that your jurisdiction might be silent on a topic altogether. And silent means that the law or code in that state doesn't address the issue at all. So the point of today's session is to provide you with a lot of answers, but as any good risk manager would do, I'm going to give you even more questions to go back and see what you can find at your state level. So we're going to talk about staffing challenges just briefly. I know you guys all know it intimately. We're going to talk about statutes, which are also known as codes, regulations and rules, and state guidelines. We're going to talk about the decision-making process and accepting an assignment. We're going to talk about delegation. I think there's a lot more after you scratch the surface with delegation. And then we're going to talk about the extent to which states acknowledge staffing issues and define abandonment. So what is happening and how did we get here? The writing has been on the wall for staffing since every single one of us started nursing school. I know that to be true. And you would think that by now we would have these problems sorted out since they've been lingering for so long. And really, the reason that we don't have them figured out is that the goalpost is moving and the landscape is changing. And it's kind of one of those things where as soon as we think we have it figured out, the rules of the game are rewritten. And in fact, we might not even be playing the same game anymore. So what happened and how did we get here? As we all know, burnout studies abound. You guys could Google 500 of them right now. Detailing the side effects of burnout, include mental and physical exhaustion, mental distance or compartmentalization about your job, cynicism about your job, and reduced efficacy in the workplace. And we've all seen those nurses when we're newly graduated and we think, I'll never be like them. But in a few months, it's so sad, but we can really quickly see how they got that way. And burnt out nurses begat other burnt out nurses. And the environment can so quickly drain us of the passion that we initially had when we became nurses. So nurses experiencing burnout, so sometimes they stay, as you know, but then sometimes they'll eventually awaken to other possibilities in another setting outside direct patient care. We also know that there are alluring nursing jobs all over the place that provide flexibility and other perks that make the jobs worth it, to leave jobs that actually really need nurses. So sometimes this competitive market kind of leaves us scratching our heads, wondering if maybe we do have enough nurses, but they're just in the wrong places because now there are all these other fields that we need nurses. They just may not be in front of a patient, such as informatics. It's booming, and we have to have nurses there. They're really important to how we run our hospitals. Another interesting fact is, would you believe it if I told you that 18% of nurses quit the profession within the first year? I don't like to quote statistics a lot, but this one's from the ANA, and I think it speaks volumes. A lot of nurses have cited that stressful working conditions, lack of leadership, and understaffed facilities are the reason that they leave. And in healthcare anymore, everyone is new, not just the nurses, the frontline nurses. We know they're new. We know there's a shortage also of experienced leadership. And so as soon as we go into nursing, we quickly see our peers become our supervisors and our managers. So the good news is that this person could soon be you, or someone you know, and understanding these staffing issues can help you be part of the solution. And sadly, we still see incivility in our work environments, which is a significant hurdle from some systems, for some units. It just depends on the culture of that setting that you're in. And while we know this is present in any industry, nursing sadly has a really bad rap for consistency of this issue. And we all know that nurses feel undervalued. And in younger nurses in particular, we feel not only undervalued, but overwhelmed at the same time. And it takes an organizational mindset that cares about the employee's well being to create an environment that people don't want to leave. And as nursing spans every generation, we know that employers have to address these feelings in many different modalities in order to touch their employees where they're at. And I know many of us think that money talks, but actually, in many different human resources studies, they're citing that the main reasons of turnover are not money. They are management, culture, overwork, poor onboarding, job role mismatch, lack of career growth, lack of work-life balance, and work inflexibility. We know that people who are happy stay. So the key isn't to pay people to the moon. We should pay people fairly. But we know that when we do increase rates for nurses, that they still eventually turn over if all of those other things that I just listed aren't there. Signing bonuses are great, and they show a quick return in recruitment, but then sometimes even show higher rates of turnover. So the compensation of nurses is hard, but we know that nurses stay at a place that makes them feel valued for the work that they do. And lastly, staffing. Staffing is the reason for the staffing crisis. Nurses feel like they're taking unsafe or unmanageable assignments. And a recent study from the ANA cited that 89% of nurses said their organization was understaffed. And as we know, these issues lead to errors and sentinel events, and often one of these is enough to ice the cake and precipitate a nurse to leave. Many professional organizations have made staffing standards one of their policy priorities, and several have become successful. So these standards provide the foundation for staffing practices, ensure that baseline level of care quality. Staffing committees are another strategy to implement safe strategy in some states. These committees are required by law. They typically consist of both direct care nurses and administration to create more balance and perspective. These committees are vital because they provide a collaborative platform for decision making, reviewing staffing patterns, and making necessary adjustments. And they're also instrumental in addressing variations that occur. They'll send them to that staffing committee and they'll review what went wrong. One of the most exciting aspects of these committees is their ability to promote innovation in staffing models. This brings us to some cutting edge developments that we're seeing in our field, such as virtual nursing support is becoming increasingly prevalent to provide co-caring. And this can be great for newer nurses who just need to phone a friend who may not need them directly there on the unit, but that can provide mentorship virtually to them. And you've all had a front row seat to the development of our current state. So now let's skim the surface of nursing regulation as it pertains to staffing. So here's another disclaimer. What you're about to hear is extremely jurisdiction sensitive. So this is sharing with you how laws are written and regulated in each state, and in each state, it's different. So I want to touch briefly on what states use to regulate our licenses, and we're going to go into a deep dive into these topics in our third installment. I hope you can make it. However, today I want to give you a high-level overview to provide some foundation for our objectives here today. So a lot of hype is given to nursing practice acts. They tell you in nursing school, before you are licensed, know your nursing practice act, inside and out, frontwards and backwards. However, I'm here to tell you that yes, while these acts are incredibly important and they're the actual law, their contents typically surround the establishment of what kinds of authority the boards have, the formation of the board, definitions, standards for education, types of licenses, titles, basic requirements, and general provisions for patient safety and public protection. However, the administrative code or the rules, which the acts provide the power of the board, the authority to offer, are really the unsung heroes of nursing regulation. So the acts say we want to establish the board. We hereby give the board the authority to create the administrative code or rules. And the rules are a much longer document that provide more details on how the act is interpreted and implemented. So that's a really big deal. It details much more specific procedures for application and renewal, specific scope of practice guidelines for different roles of nursing and levels of licensure, CE requirements, specific disciplinary procedures, and depending on the state, this is also where some states tuck their advanced practice guidance. So I'm here to tell you, the act is great. You should read it. But if you really want to go deep and kind of come closer to the work that you're actually doing, read the rules. They're a hidden gem of resources. So long story short, what we're taking away from this is the Nursing Practice Act gives the board the authority to write the rules. And the rules are good to be familiar with. So state boards have other modalities of defining in a non-regulatory sense an issue that perhaps isn't worthy of legislation or jumping through all those hoops, or sometimes the board needs to get out an opinion or interpretation of the law that cannot wait for the legislative process. So in these instances, the boards have other ways to make the public and licensees aware of their viewpoints. And we saw this a lot with COVID. They immediately had to interpret laws on telehealth and physician supervision. And as we saw, many states kind of wrote out the waivers that came down from us federally and then adopted those into what are called their permanent rules. So they used temporary orders that the governors authored to help us get through COVID. And then a lot of them realized, oh, telehealth isn't going anywhere. We're going to have to actually tuck this into the rules or make further interpretations or position statements. So guidelines are recommendations or suggestions provided by the Board of Nursing to help nurses interpret and apply nursing law and regulation. They offer direction on best practice, but they're not typically legally binding. They're still important, and we're going to talk about why. Practice policies are different from a policy with a capital P. Policy with a capital P implies that it's a law. These are more like policies that detail actual practices and provide guidance to licensees and entities. So there might be a policy on LPN medication infusion through IV, and it will detail exactly what their scope of practice is. So that's policy with a lowercase p that nursing boards use. There are position statements, and those are official stances that are taken by the board on nursing specific issues relating to practice, education, or regulation. So they provide clarity on the board's interpretation of the laws or regulation, but again, don't have the force of law themselves. They're just saying, this is the board, this is how we feel about this. And there'll often be one on school nurses or entry into practice from nursing school. And then also, lastly, there are declaratory rulings from nursing boards. And these are formal, these are binding interpretations issued by the Board of Nursing in response to specific questions on how nursing laws or regulations apply to particular situations. So they have the weight of law, and they can be used to guide your future decisions on similar issues. Often they're authored by the board or the attorney general themselves. So why does all of this matter? This matters because if your license is called into question by the board, or you are questioned by a plaintiff's attorney in a malpractice case, your practice is going to depend on three things: the law, the standard of care, so what your professional nursing organization says, and lastly, they will pull up statements like these that, while they may or may not have the effect and weight of law, they'll say, well, it's the interpretation of the board. Why didn't you act in this way? The board's issued this statement. So there's so much that we are responsible for knowing as nurses. So if you like to nerd out on all of this stuff like I do, please make sure you make it to our third and final installment, because it's a lot more layers of what we just discussed. So should I accept this assignment? Let me make sure we're in the right place. So in many ways, an assignment is a delegation. It's a delegation from a licensed person for a specific patient load. So we're going to weave in and out of the themes of assignment, delegation, and abandonment, because really they're much more closely related than I originally thought. So in a variety of scenarios, a presumed nurse-patient relationship is necessary to establish the basis for abandonment. So you can't have abandonment without the establishment of the relationship. There are exceptions to this rule. For most nursing, I'll use that caveat, you're going to have a patient relationship that's formally established. So the key to putting yourself in a safe place when you practice is to have some sort of internal decision-making process around accepting your assignment. So most jurisdictions will not attempt to prescribe staffing. They won't touch it with a 10-foot pole because it's so nuanced. However, some state boards, either their act or their rules or their position statements, may have language detailing nurse conduct that can result in disciplinary action. An example of this would be, this is a quote: conduct which jeopardizes a patient's life, health, or safety that shall include but isn't limited to the following: delegating or accepting the delegation of a nursing function or prescribed healthcare function when the delegation or acceptance of could reasonably be expected to result in unsafe or ineffective patient care. Another language that they use is failure to utilize appropriate judgment in administering safe nursing practice or patient care assignment based upon the level of nursing for which the individual is licensed or recognized. And then lastly, another example is they'll say failure to exercise technical competence in carrying out nursing care to a patient or patient care assignment. So with that said, let's talk a little bit more about what your decision-making process should look like. So first, what's the assignment? The devil is in the details, so always clarify exactly what is expected from you. What are the characteristics of the patients being assigned? As we know, we're in a more acute state than we've ever been before with the health of our population, so it's not just about the number of patients. Do you have the expertise to care for these patients? Are you familiar with these types of patients that they want to assign you? Is this a float assignment? Are you cross-trained to care for these patients? Is there a buddy system in place with people who are familiar with the unit? And if there is no cross-training or buddy system, has the patient load been modified accordingly? So maybe if you're not as fluent in these kinds of patients, maybe you would take half the load or 3/4 of a load of a nurse that normally works in that unit. Do you have experience and knowledge to manage the patients that you're being assigned care? If the answer is no, you have an obligation to articulate your limitations. If no accommodations for limitations is considered, then the nurse has an obligation to refuse an assignment when she lacks the education or expertise to safely care for them. What's the geography of this assignment? Are you being asked to care for patients who are close in proximity, or do you have one patient on the third floor and one patient on the first floor? And if you're going back and forth, who's watching that other patient for immediate care needs? There are some states that even interpret that as abandonment. If you have a patient in one building and a patient in the other, if there was an immediate need, they couldn't get you. Is this a temporary assignment? When other staff are located to assist, will you be relieved? is if the assignment is temporary, it may be possible to accept a difficult assignment knowing there will soon be reinforcements. Also to note, is there a pattern of short staffing, or is this truly an emergency, like an influx into an ER after a catastrophic event? Is this a crisis, or is this an ongoing staffing problem? That's something good to ask yourself too. Is it being made because of an immediate need or crisis on the unit, like in an ER where there's been a catastrophic event? Or is this something that happens over and over and over and that is kind of an indication of a systemic problem? In that case, you might request for a safe harbor or peer review of the assignment. And lastly, can you take the assignment in good faith? If not, you might need to get the assignment modified or refuse the assignment, and always consult your state specific guidance, both regulatory and from your nursing association. So both from the board and from the association, two different things. One's regulatory, one's the law, one's the association. So that's more of an advocacy component regarding clarification on accepting an assignment in good faith. With the increasing dependency on new care models and interdisciplinary care teams, delegating responsibility to me is the new black. It's crucial that we tap into delegation to protect your license. So I want to share some instances of delegation gone wrong. In an acute care unit, a nurse delegates to an unlicensed to feed a recent stroke patient. This particular unlicensed did not have the competency necessary to perform. The patient aspirates, and in this instance, the nurse did not match the needs of the patient with the skill of the delegatee. So the delegatee is who's performing it. Next example, in a busy ER, a nurse delegates to an LPN IV administration of a cardiac medication requiring titration and monitoring. Even though the LPN might be competent to perform IV therapy, this drug and the level of monitoring required was out of scope for her. The RN didn't consider the special training needed for the task, and the nurse didn't provide adequate supervision, and this patient would be at risk for an adverse medication event. An LDRP nurse, in another example, has two fresh postpartum patients. Both are requiring uterine fundal tone checks and bleeding assessments. But because one of the moms is only a few hours out for delivery, she sends the unlicensed to go take care of the one who's further out to check the patient. And so while this assessment kind of resembles peri-care, and that should be within the scope of an unlicensed, the diagnosis of a postpartum maternal hemorrhage is then delayed until the next check, 30 minutes later, when the nurse finally made her way back into the patient's room. So all of these are examples of wrongful delegation, and the nurse still remains responsible for the outcome. But there's good news for all of us. There's actually a gold standard on delegation, and sadly, it wasn't until I worked for the board and well after I'd been at the bedside for many years that I even knew this existed. This diagram is from a co-authored document from the National Council of State Boards of Nursing, and like I said, I'll refer to them as the NCSBN, and the ANA. And this is important because the NCSBN is a regulatory agency and they rarely publish documents. They even more rarely do them with a professional organization. So when these two bodies got together to write this document, it was a really big deal. So they break it down into 3 areas of responsible parties, which is super helpful for me because I'm the kind of person I want to know exactly who's responsible for what. So first, the employer nurse leader responsibilities. It's essential for employers to identify a nursing leader who can oversee the delegation practices. They have to determine which nursing tasks can be delegated and to whom and under what circumstances. And developing clear delegation policies and procedures is vital, and as well as periodically evaluating these processes to ensure that they're still effective. Moving on to licensed nurse responsibilities, nurses need to assess the patient needs carefully and decide when and what to delegate. And it's important for nurses to be available for support and supervision once those tasks are delegated. They must also evaluate the outcome of the task. So it's not over just once you tell them to go do it. They've got to maintain the accountability and responsibility once they've assigned these tasks. And lastly, the delegatee has responsibilities as well. Those who are delegated tasks should only accept those that align with their competency level. And maintaining competence in these responsibilities is key in being accountable for completing them accurately. So patient safety hinges on the intersections of these diagrams. So training and education, two-way communication, and information about processes and competence. And all of these principles intersect into the 5 rights of delegation. So while I'm certain that all of us can probably rattle off all of the rights of medication administration, I have to admit I didn't familiarize myself with the rights of delegation until I truly needed it in my practice. So the first item is right task. What does that mean? Sounds pretty simple. Well, the task must be within the delegatee's job description. Their job description has to say that they can do it. And there has to be a standard policy and procedure in the nursing setting. So let's go back to pericare. And you want to delegate it to an unlicensed. That task needs to be in their job description, and the facility should have a policy and procedure that tells them the exact steps on how to do it. So a lot of these now are assigned in modules, and then you'll have a preceptor that checks you off. So it's the job of the nurse and the delegatee to understand, yes, I can do this task, or I can delegate this task. Now, what about circumstance? And this is such a big one for me. The health condition of the patient must be stable. I cannot underscore this enough. So going back to our patient who needed pericare 30 minutes after delivery, that patient is not stable. So even though the steps of the nurse, the unlicensed might know how to do them, and the task is standardized, an unstable patient turns the whole thing on its head and does not check the box for right circumstance. So circumstance is about the patient being stable enough to delegate one of those things to. Is the delegatee the right person? The nurse, the employer, and the delegatee are all responsible for ensuring that the appropriate skills and knowledge to perform the activity are in place. And so, as we know, nurses now are highly specialized and they are not all the same. And we can't have that same expectations of unlicensed either. All of us have worked with career unlicensed who you can send into any situation. They'll immediately come to you and know that something's not right. But there are also unlicensed that we know we still want to go in the room with them when they first see the patient just to make sure that everything's okay and that they're comfortable walking into that patient's room. So it's up to us, the nurse, to ensure that we're delegating to the right person before we assign a task. We often hear that orders from a provider should be patient specific, meaning the provider intended that specific order for that patient. The exact same is true for delegation. So with right directions and communication, we are responsible for ensuring each delegation is patient specific. We can't say, hey, go turn everyone on this whole unit and I'll see you in an hour. That's not how this works. This delegation has to be based on the nurse's assessment of that patient. This patient needs X, Y, or Z. So the delegatee must accept the delegation, and the nurse must ensure that the delegatee is aware that they cannot make modifications to the assignment without first consulting the nurse. So if they go in the patient's room and the patient isn't exactly how the nurse described, the state that she described them in, they need to come right back out and say, whoa, I thought this patient was going to be up and performing ADLs. They're completely sedated. Do I need to change the plan of care for this patient? They cannot change it independently. The nurse has to do it with them. And something important to know, I want to circle back to what some jurisdictions have written into their statutes, rules, or guidelines, that a nurse can face discipline for delegating or accepting the delegation of a nursing function when the delegation or acceptance thereof could reasonably expect it to result in unsafe or ineffective patient care. And some states even expand this interpretation of delegation of nursing assignments to staffing. So what does this mean? This means that nurses have the right to both give and receive safe delegations. And it's not about just assigning tasks. It's about staying engaged throughout the process. And as a licensed nurse, you're responsible for supervising how the delegated activity is progressing. And this means checking in with the delegatee once the task is completed and evaluating how it impacts the patient's outcomes. It's essential to be available and ready to step in if needed, ensuring that everything runs smoothly. And on the flip side, the delegatee has just as much of an important job to keep the lines of communication open with you regarding how the activity went. And so this collaboration, I know communication is just paramount, but really this two-way dialogue makes sure that the delegation continues to be safe. And finally, documentation. The licensed nurse should always make sure that the activities are properly documented, capturing every detail for future reference. So the activity is on the nurse and the documentation that it got done. And even if that is the unlicensed documenting it and you going behind it and making sure it's accurate, the whole package rolls up to the nurse. So the next thing we're going to talk about is abandonment. So who defines abandonment? The ANA has defined abandonment as the unilateral severance of an established nurse-patient relationship without giving reasonable notice to the appropriate person so that arrangements could be made for the continuation of nursing care by others. The NCSBN says abandonment means the intentional leaving of a patient for whom the nurse is responsible without providing for another nurse or appropriate caretaker to assume care upon the nurse's leaving. And then many jurisdictions define abandonment, and some even go as far as to define what isn't abandoned and instead may represent something like an employment issue. And we'll get into those a little bit more in a minute. But typically, these definitions are not written into the law and instead use what we talked about earlier, which are guidelines or position statements to address this issue. And some jurisdictions are actually silent on nursing abandonment and don't say anything at all. You'll often see the medical board publish something about provider abandonment, which is completely different. So you'll see a myriad of this, but I wanted to give you an example of how different this can look in every state. And I love this slide because this is just a sample of some abandonment statements that I've come across in my practice. So these are all published by state boards of nursing. And I love this slide because it sheds some light as to what I mean by jurisdiction specific or jurisdiction sensitive. You can even tell by how they appear that their contents are even going to be vastly different from one another. So some jurisdictions that have these kind of statements include, certainly not an encompassing list, Arizona, California, Connecticut, Kentucky, Maryland, Minnesota, Missouri, Mississippi, Nebraska, New Hampshire, New York, North Dakota, Oregon, Oklahoma, Tennessee, Texas, and Virginia. And as I mentioned, several of them dispel instances that are considered employment issues, which are not considered to be patient abandonment. And as a side note, some of these didn't get defined until COVID happened. And all of a sudden, we were in this crisis, and a lot of nurses really needed to know what abandonment meant. And then they had a lot of questions like, well, if I don't show up tomorrow, is that abandonment? And so a lot of nursing boards made the decision to elaborate on the statements they already have or develop one if they didn't have one. Shockingly, a lot of states have had these for a long time. So we've all heard examples of abandonment that sound like a nurse walking off the shift with no report, no handoff, or nothing. And is that abandonment? Absolutely. However, there are some other examples of abandonment that we may see more likely to play out in practice. And so again, this is just a sampling of what all those documents in the previous slide said. So while they may be specific to that jurisdiction, they're generalized statements that we can take to kind of assess our own practice. So leaving the unit or the care setting without providing notice and report of the patient's current status to a qualified person. That's a big underline. Leaving the workplace when the nurse is the sole provider at their level of licensure. So examples of these can be home health and hospice. Failing to report for an assignment when this nurse is the only nurse, so private duty or home health, without notice to a qualified person. And I want to point out the difference between this and the employment issue that we're going to talk about on the next slide. So this is not showing up when you're the only person scheduled. Leaving abruptly without giving the supervisor or qualified person adequate notice for replacing the nurse, leaving without reporting to the oncoming shift, accepting an assignment for patient care and then leaving the unit or patient care setting without notifying personnel, Sleeping is actually defined by many states to be abandonment, and that's if you have an active patient load at that time. An example where sleeping would be appropriate is a lot of state boards would urge you to follow your hospital's policy if you're going to sleep in between shifts, if you're staying to ride out a storm. Those should all be detailed in your facility's policy, and you would need to follow that. Terminating a contractual or otherwise relationship in which the nurse, again, is the primary provider. Failing to provide an expected home visit without prior notification to home health or hospice, again, that same situation. And then leaving an emergency care patient situation that would be considered overtly dangerous based on the standard of actions of a similarly qualified, reasonable, and prudent licensed nurse. So now I want to talk about what isn't abandonment. And these are in some places, some jurisdictions. And I've had so many phone calls of people asking, well, is this considered abandonment? And detailing an employment experience. So although these issues are generally considered employment matters between a nurse and the employer rather than patient abandonment, they still might have consequences for employment, such as disciplinary action or termination. The key distinction is that patient abandonment occurs when a nurse has already accepted responsibility for the patient care and then leaves without handoff. So here's a list of kind of what fall more in line of an employment issue. Um, Failing to call in, not showing up or arriving late for a shift, so a no call, no show. Refusing an assignment for religious, cultural, legal, or ethical reasons, refusing to work in an unsafe situation or an area that you're not trained in or with equipment that you have no competency in, refusing to give care that may harm the patient, refusing to delegate patient care to an unsafe delegatee, refusing to work mandatory overtime, not returning from a leave of absence, ending employment without sufficient notice. There's not, in many states, any law that says you're required to give them 2 weeks or any sort of notification. It might be required by your contract, and it might have employment fallout. But as far as being abandonment, it's not considered abandonment in most places. Refusing to work a remaining scheduled shifts after resigning. You don't have to, sometimes employers will say, well, you need to finish your schedule. In many jurisdictions, you're not required to finish your schedule. Refusing to come in and cover a shift that you're not assigned to, and refusing an assignment before starting work or accepting responsibility for patients, like refusing to work in a COVID unit before the beginning of the shift. So all of these in most places are not considered abandonment and instead are just employment issues. So in closing, I wish I could just detail all the calls that I got from working at the board with nurses who were lamenting over complex employment issues. And while these are not directly tied to your professional liability, they can contribute to difficult circumstances that place a nurse in a position to make a judgment call with no reasonable or even safe solutions. So my recommendations are always to align yourself with an employer that identifies with your moral, ethical, and legal obligations. The beauty of nursing is that we're marketable and that we get to choose where we work. Stress associated with moral dilemmas and constant worry could lead you to burnout. So, if you're constantly in a position where you feel moral distress over accepting an assignment, it's a good time to ask yourself, is this employer for me? Am I going to burn myself out if I'm constantly being put in this situation? And lastly, professional growth and job satisfaction are crucial to a long and enjoyable nursing career. We all worked so hard to be nurses. I don't think anybody thought, oh, well, I'm really excited to be a nurse. I'm only going to do it for 6 years. No, we want a career that we can grow in and continue to flourish in. And so all these things really are required for us to be happy doing what we do and providing safe care. And when in doubt, a litmus test for a safe environment that will nourish your nursing career is an employer that demonstrates commitment to safe staffing, proper resources, ongoing education, and a culture of safety and ethical practice that not only protects the nurse's license, but directly contributes to better patient care and satisfaction. And I always tell nurses, and I said this in my last presentation, I'll say it again, Many of us became nurses because we have a spidey sense in our core that helps us navigate between right and wrong and alerts us when something just doesn't feel right. So listen to it. And I promise you, if you do, you will always sleep well at night. Here are a couple resources. And then I will hope that you join me for our closing webinar in this series where we go deep into nursing regulation and potential licensure issues at the same time, 10 a.m. Eastern on November 12th. I quickly wanted to introduce Erin. She is hosting me to provide this to you guys today. She is the pro liability, professional liability, or malpractice insurance liaison between pro liability and Sigma. And lastly, in closing, I want to thank you guys so much for attending, and I'll hand it back over to Linda.
Thank you so much for all of this great information. We're getting positive feedback in the chat feature. Let's go ahead and start with maybe a clarifying question about the role of NCSBN and what their ability is for regulatory. Do they have regulatory authority at all, or is that more the state boards of nursing?
Great question and spot on. We'll go big into this in the third one. So, no, they do not regulate your license. What they do is they create a model nursing practice act and a model rules. It's revised regularly, it's reviewed regularly. They have span across continents. There are many international boards that look to them for guidance as well. So they are a international think tank of nursing regulation experts. They're a nonprofit organization. So they don't touch your license, they don't regulate your license. But when they write model acts and model rules, they host meetings all the time. All the state board executive directors will go. Many states model what they have after what the NCSBN has written. So while they can't discipline or do anything to your license whatsoever, but the state boards look to them for guidance as to how to do that. Great question.
Perfect. And then, as you know, nurses today, we encounter many patients that have suffered themselves severe trauma, and therefore nurses experience secondary trauma. What do you have to say in light of how that affects maybe patient abandonment, or what that looks like if a nurse really needs to step away for their own mental well-being?
Do it the right way. Learn about trauma informed care. I think that what I've heard just from nurses on our helpline is that when they become more informed about the delivery of trauma informed care to a patient, it helps them as well. So, the biggest thing though is that if you need to walk away for any reason, do it right. Go straight to who you report to. Say, I need help. And do it in a way that complies with your facility's policy and your states. Look up their statements and see what you can find. But absolutely, there are, and I'm a big proponent of acknowledging third victims as well. So when a big safety event happens or a sentinel event, if you think for 1 minute a nurse meant to cause harm to a patient, I always say you're wrong. We did not show up to work to hurt someone that day. And I promise the nurse is always grieving an error. So I think that trauma informed nursing provides us some of that same light.
Perfect. Thank you so much. We have a couple questions about delegation. So the first question is, what do you do when there are no qualified delegees, I guess you could say? And then the second question is, what if the nurse is hyper vigilant and is anxious or nervous about the delegation, and how can they combat being almost a micromanager, if you will?
Two great questions. So the first one, if there is no one qualified to delegate to, very simply put, you don't get to delegate it. Now, if that's part of the staffing model of your facility, um, I would take that to your leadership and say, hey, like it's built into our staffing model that we have an unlicensed that we can delegate X, Y, and Z for. And I don't have that. Either the person's not there or the person who they've provided can't do those things. That's big fallout for the staffing for the rest of the shift. So that's important information to them. So if there's no one there that's qualified, then you don't get to delegate it. And then on being nervous with delegating, that takes time. It takes mutual understanding. It reminds me often of how they quickly talk about when two pilots get on a plane, the odds are they've never flown together before. So that pre-conference of getting to know your team before you start your shift is just vital. And saying, hey, how do you feel about this? How do you feel about this? I had these patients yesterday. Likely we're going to need to do X, Y, and Z. Is that something you can do? Or do I need to assume that duty and you do this instead? So getting to know who you're working with, we have the luxury most of the time, not everybody, not travel nurses or people who float or someone who's different, somewhere different every day. Um, that's different, but hopefully you can have that download of safety before you start. In surgery, we do it before every single case. Odds are I haven't worked with that anesthesiologist before. I may have never worked with that scrub tech before. I may have never worked with the surgeon before. Typically, we try to circle the wagons before we go back, even if it's just for a couple seconds. So I think getting to know who you're working with um, is always super helpful. And when you don't have that luxury, plan out your care for the shift, download that together, and then reassess. Say, hey, let's get back together every whichever cadence of time. And that way it provides structure and autonomy at the same time.
Great. Thank you for answering both of those questions. Now, what about when nurses have continually brought their staffing concerns to management and leadership? Can a bedside nurse contact their state boards when the management or leadership of their hospital system continues to place nurses in these very challenging positions of not being adequately staffed?
So, depending on the state, most states, so yes, if somebody holds a license, you can turn them into the board. I think the best thing to do is to make sure you're following your escalation at your facility, being super transparent. If there's a staffing committee, going to them. But then also, if this is a situation that you're being put in over and over again, just saying that you reported it to the board wouldn't be enough because you're still putting yourself in that position. So the best thing to do would be to remove yourself from a position, whether it's going to another unit, going to another job. Um, Pull yourself from the unsafe situation, because if you're getting questioned in front of the board of nursing, they're going to say, well, why did you just go somewhere else? Because a nursing investigation, if you were to turn them in, whoever the license holder is, typically the state boards don't regulate hospitals. They only regulate people who hold licenses. So you would be complaining just against somebody who had a license, and the board would have to go through and investigate all of that. Um, for immediate safety, you would want to be able to say that you removed yourself from the situation, or like in that slide where it talks about your decision making process for accepting a delegation or an assignment. If you quickly find out that this wasn't just a one shift deal, this is every shift that I'm here, that's a time that you would want to think, is this the right place for me? I feel like they're putting my license in jeopardy.
And then let's close out with just one more question. How can you avoid being accused of abandonment, either short or long term, if you are in an organization where staffing issues continue to be ongoing and lead to an unsafe environment? Very comparable to the last question. And then who could you report this information to?
Absolutely. So the first thing that we always do to defend ourselves would be to document. It's not necessarily you wouldn't document it per se in the patient record, like, I'm super busy, I had 6 other patients, I couldn't get to it. You could go more of a route of incident reporting. Um, Incident reporting now in hospitals is often, it can be anonymous. Um, it can identify units that have problems. It's non-punitive. You won't get in trouble. And I see a lot of hospitals use that mechanism as their feedback to signal to hospital administration where problems might be. Hospitals now use a just culture, which means we don't automatically jump to, oh, you did something wrong, this is your fault. They're wanting to learn from where we're making errors. We're called to do that ethically as healthcare administrators. But similar to the last question, if it's something systemic, you pick up on that and you remove yourself from the situation because it's no one else is looking out for your license but you. And when I went to work at the board, I quickly realized it was my job, when I had led hundreds of nurses, to make sure that they had safe delegations. And if that can't be done, we need to stop and assess and make sure that everything's right. But continually putting yourself in that situation, though, exposes you to liability.
Perfect. Thank you so much for sharing all of this great information with us today, Madison. Sigma is grateful that you took the time to share with this audience, and we definitely look forward to hearing more from you in the future. We hope that you enjoyed this webinar. We have updated our process and shared the link in the chat several times for you to log into our learning management system and complete the evaluation to obtain your certificate right away as this webinar concludes. If you cannot access the link, please do not worry, because we will also email all of the registered attendees with the link in approximately 1 week. Thank you, and we invite you to join us for our remaining one webinar in this series, Creating Safety Nets for Your Nursing Practice. Protect your patients, protect yourself. Thank you. Have a wonderful day.